Now today's watercolour tutorial for you is how to paint a background for a subject without the use of masking fluid. Let's get the brushes wet and let's get started. I'm going to use a very large brush. This is a size 8, one made by FREEBIE. It's also quite inexpensive and also synthetic as well. Okay, now make sure that the tape is stuck all the way around before you put a background on. And this is low tack tape, remember, that's what I'm using here. So you want to wet the background probably 2, maybe even 3 times. The more times you wet the background, the longer it will stay wet and give you a little bit more working time as well. Just be very careful when you work around the edge of the kingfisher, okay? Or any picture that you're painting, doesn't have to be this one of course. Now once you've wetted it thoroughly, let's go for our really dark chocolatey colour at the moment first of all. I really want a very dark background on this. And to achieve a dark background, you really need your pigments to be more of a creamy consistency really. Because we have to remember that watercolour very often dries much lighter than it is when you first put it on the paper. I know, very often does, doesn't it? But as long as you've got really good quality paper, but once it's really bone dry, you can add another layer of paint over the top. And I'll show you how to do that very shortly. Apply the paint in random patterns. Don't be too precious about it. Just be very careful, obviously, around the edges of the branch and the bird. But in this case, I'm just going around just putting little dots of colour here and there, leaving gaps in between. Now these gaps are there really to allow space for other colours to show through. But because we've wetted the paper first of all, we know that the water on the paper will soften that colour down. It could weaken that pigment, which means it could dry that a little bit paler. Then you can go in with the darker colour, which is a coal colour. I know, lovely colour, isn't it? But again, I'm being very careful, even though I've got a very large brush by the way, I'm being very careful to not get too close to that bird. This is why you need a very good tip on that brush. So it doesn't matter what size brush you use to this degree, not for this background anyway, as long as you've got a very fine tip on it. And all I'm simply doing from this point onwards is filling in all those gaps I've left behind. But it doesn't mean to say that's got to be how it's going to be, because we can change that around as much as you want. You can obviously lift a little bit of paint off whilst it's damp, or whilst it's wet in this case, and add another colour in there as well. But I really want sort of brown earthy tones and a really dark background, which will then enable the kingfisher to stand out against that background. When you're working around something like this particular bird, you've got to think about that beak. So I'm trying to cut in to the edge of the beak very carefully when I'm doing this. So just be careful, whatever your subject you're painting, when you're working around the edges of it, just be very, very careful how you do that. But remember, because I've wetted the paper more than once, I'm still working on that damp paper, which is really, really useful. And that also means I can go back to another area around the paper and carry on there as well. So for example, this top right hand corner, I can work along there with a smaller brush. This is the one that came with the Regina's watercolour kit, which is a really nice little travel brush, it really is. And a good tip on it as well, which is important to me. And you can fine tune around your subject then, as long as the paper is still wet. It needs to be wet, don't forget. If you see the shine going off the paper, then make sure that you don't go back to the area up until it's completely bone dry. Then you can add another layer over the top. Because if you paint on that paper whilst it's still a little bit damp, then you'll end up with cauliflower marks, blemishes, blooms, whatever you want to call it, over the paper. But a lot of people like that. In fact, I do for certain subjects, which can then add interest to the background. I know. Then all you need to do is get some kitchen roll and tidy up around the edge of the painting. Right, it's nice and dry. Size 4 brush by FREEBIE products again. I know they did send me quite a few of them recently, so I do like to have a play with different brushes on camera. You'll find they all work in different ways. Some have got more springs, some have got less springs, some have got longer points, shorter points. Some have a larger body within the bristles of the brush, which then in turn gives you more of a water holding property within those bristles. So in other words, it will hold more paint. So now I'm trying to darken the painting, darken it down. But I still want some of those browns to show through. I want this to be really dark on the paper, but not black. If you wanted it black, well, you just paint it black, don't you? With a little bit of colour added into it as well. Black can look a bit flat on its own. So still allow some of the brown to show through that lovely chocolatey colour I've got on there. You could probably mix a similar chocolate colour of your own by using something like burnt umber and burnt sienna, for example. Or burnt umber with a little bit, let's say Scarlet Lake. So you want to very carefully re-wet that background just the once and then go over the top of that with some more colour to darken it as you go along. Then you can either leave it to dry or give it a blast with a hairdryer. Now that everything is nice and dry, I need to tidy up the edges of the branches and around the bird. I can do this with a lifting off brush or a small bristle brush, anything will do. The stiffer the bristles, the more paint it will lift off, so bear that in mind. So if you've got some fine detailed, say oil painting brushes or acrylic painting brushes, you find they might lift the paint off a little bit easier, but beware, because you've got to be very careful not to lift too much paint off and then damage the paper surface underneath. And you'll know when that happens because the paper will start to bubble. In other words, bits will start coming off that paper. So all I'm doing, as you can see, is lifting off very carefully, then dabbing that with a cleanish piece of kitchen roll. That's all I'm using, just to lift off that residual paint. And that sort of tidies up that branch, ready for when I paint it later on. So this is a really good way of adding a background around an image, around a subject matter, whatever subject that might be, without the need for masking fluid. You just have to be extra careful when you're working around the subject. Be it a cat, a dog, in my case a kingfisher, a rabbit, whatever it might be. Just pay extra attention to the very edges of that outline. Now if you're interested in looking at other videos all about how to work with backgrounds, I'll pop a link to the top right hand corner of the screen for you. I'll see you there.